My name is Miriam Doyle and I am 29 years old. 3 years ago, at a birthday dinner scheduled for a Friday evening that both women in this story insisted was simply the only night everyone could make, I watched my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law trade a look across the table when I said I would need to leave before sundown, a look that told me exactly how little either one of them believed my reason for going. 6 weeks ago, in a hospital corridor in St. Joseph, Michigan, those same two women stood on either side of me, both of them crying, both of them finally saying the same 4 words to me within an hour of each other. I want to tell you about the 3 years in between, because I know some of you have spent years being told your faithfulness was really just stubbornness wearing a nicer word, and I do not think we hear often enough how a story like that can actually end, especially when it takes 2 different people the same amount of proof before either one of them believes it. If you have ever had more than one person in your husband's or wife's family looking at your faith like an inconvenience rather than a conviction, this one is for you. Go ahead and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, because I read every single one. Let me take you back to a lecture hall at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, where I first met a boy who thought sundown was just a word in a weather report, and to the Friday evening, a little over a year later, when his mother and his sister both made it clear exactly how little that word meant to either one of them. I grew up in Berrien Springs itself, in a family that has kept the Sabbath faithfully for 3 generations, since my great-grandmother first heard a traveling preacher in a tent meeting and never once looked back. My father is an optometrist with a small practice downtown, and my mother taught elementary school for nearly 30 years, and our house ran on a rhythm most of my friends outside the faith found strange the first time they saw it up close. The whole kitchen scrubbed and quiet by Friday sundown, the phone left alone, a full day set aside every single week not for rules but for rest, for walks along the St. Joseph River, for long unhurried dinners with nowhere else to be. My grandmother kept a small worn Bible on the kitchen windowsill her whole life, its cover soft from handling, and she used to tell me that the Sabbath was not a fence God built to keep us out of something, it was a table He built to keep us close to Him, and I have carried that sentence with me through every hard year since. Berrien Springs itself is a small town built almost entirely around the seminary and the university at its center, and growing up there meant growing up surrounded by families who kept the same rhythm mine did, so it was not until I left for college classes that included students from every kind of background that I understood how strange our Friday evenings looked from the outside. The whole town seeming to exhale at once as the sun dropped, porch lights coming on early, whole families walking slowly along the river with nowhere they needed to be. I met Caleb Doyle in a shared economics class at Andrews University, where he was finishing a business degree and I was studying to become a dietitian. He sat 2 rows over, asked sharp, careful questions that told me he was actually listening rather than performing for the professor. And within about 4 months, the thing I looked forward to most about Tuesday mornings had a name. We did not really talk until a group project paired us together, and Caleb looked over my portion of the work a long while before saying, with total seriousness, that I had arrived at the right answer using a method the textbook had not actually covered yet, and then spent the next 20 minutes showing me the textbook method without once making me feel foolish for having found my own way there first. I have thought about that afternoon many times since, because it turned out to be exactly the shape of the man I married. Careful, unhurried, more interested in getting somewhere true together than in being right first. He told me early on that he had grown up in Birch Hollow, a small town about 30 minutes east of Berrien Springs, the son of a man who ran the town's only auto repair shop, and a woman, his mother Diane, who taught a women's Bible study at Riverside Community Church and had for nearly 2 decades. He described his church to me warmly. An ordinary Sunday morning congregation, worship band, a service that ran a clean hour, potlucks that stretched into the afternoon. I told him about Maple Ridge, my own church, the quiet certainty of a whole day set apart rather than a single morning, and he told me that sounded like a lovely kind of discipline, and I told him his Sunday mornings sounded warm in their own right, and neither one of us meant it as a complaint. We dated the better part of 2 years, and there were long conversations in that stretch, sitting on the same river bench where he would later propose, working out together what a shared life might actually look like across two different rhythms. Caleb asked me once, early on, whether I ever resented the whole structure of it, the sundown deadlines, the friends who did not understand why I could not simply reschedule, and I told him honestly that I resented the explaining sometimes, but never once the resting itself, that the resting had never felt like a cage to me, only ever like a room I got to walk into once a week where nothing was required of me except my own presence. He told me that was the first time anyone had described a religious rule to him in a way that sounded like relief rather than restriction, and I have wondered since whether some part of him carried that description into every hard conversation with his mother and sister that followed, a quiet, private translation running underneath all their arguments that neither woman ever got to hear. By the time he brought me out to Birch Hollow to meet his family, I already loved him enough that I did not think anything short of outright cruelty could change my mind, though I had no idea yet how ordinary the first real friction would feel. Diane did not do anything cruel that first Sunday afternoon cookout. She hugged me at the door, complimented the pie I had brought, and asked warmly enough about my family. It was Caleb's older sister, Brooke, married with 2 children of her own already, who asked, over dessert, whether it was true I could not even flip a light switch on a Saturday, laughing as though she had made a joke rather than a test. And I told her plainly that it was not quite that strict, that the day was really about rest and presence rather than a list of forbidden switches. And she said, well, that's a relief, sounds exhausting otherwise, and laughed again in a way that had a small edge folded into it I did not fully understand until later. Diane, across the table, said only, that's certainly a different way to grow up, and changed the subject to Caleb's father's shop. And I understood even that first afternoon that I would be doing most of the explaining in this family, and that not everyone at that table intended their questions kindly. I heard the real shape of it about an hour later, stepping onto the back porch for my sweater and hearing Diane's voice through the screen door, lower than she meant it to carry, telling Caleb she just worried a household built around so many rules might end up teaching their children that God's love has to be earned one Saturday at a time. And Caleb said, Mom, it's not like that. And Diane said, I know how it can start out not like that and end up exactly like that. And I stood on that porch a long moment with my sweater in my hands before going back inside, deciding right then I would not let one overheard sentence decide the shape of the rest of my life, though it took me longer than I expected to keep that decision fully. I did not know it yet, standing there in the dark, but I would think of that exact sentence again, years later, sitting beside a hospital bed on a Friday night I had never planned to spend anywhere but at home. Caleb proposed the following spring, on a bench along the St. Joseph River where we had walked most Sabbath afternoons that whole first year, telling me plainly he could not picture a single good year ahead of him without me standing somewhere in the middle of it. He called his mother that same night, and I sat close enough to hear her voice thin through the phone, and the very first thing she asked, before congratulations, was whether we had talked through how a Sabbath-keeping wife might handle holidays and grandchildren someday, and Caleb told her we had not settled everything yet, which was true, and she was quiet a moment and then said, well, I do hope you two think that through carefully, because it will touch more than just your own Saturdays. It was not a slammed door, but it was not a warm one either. Diane came to our wedding, held at Maple Ridge on a Sunday afternoon, since the ceremony itself did not fall on a Sabbath, and I want to say that plainly, because it matters. She has never once, in this entire story, missed a holiday or a birthday out of pure spite. My own father walked me down the aisle that afternoon, and I remember him leaning in just before he let go of my arm to tell me my grandmother would have loved seeing the sunlight coming through those plain windows at exactly that hour, since she always said the best kind of light for a wedding was the ordinary kind. Ordinary daylight, nothing dressed up about it. Diane sat in the 4th pew during the ceremony itself, hands folded tightly in her lap, and I noticed, without fully understanding what I was noticing at the time, that her eyes stayed open through nearly the whole thing, watching the plain, unhurried service the way you might watch something you were told in advance to be cautious of, though nothing about that afternoon gave her any real reason to be. What she withdrew from me was quieter than her body leaving a room. At the rehearsal dinner the night before, which Diane hosted at her own house, she stood to welcome everyone and spent nearly 5 minutes describing Caleb's whole life at Riverside, his baptism there at age 11, the summer camps, the youth group mission trips, and never once mentioned Maple Ridge or my own family or the fact that a second, very different rhythm of faith was joining this one by marriage the next day. Brooke, over coffee that same evening, leaned toward me and said, lightly enough that she clearly meant it as harmless, "I do hope tomorrow doesn't run past sundown. Wouldn't want you turning into a pumpkin on us," and laughed. And the whole table laughed along with her, and it was only walking to the car afterward that I understood exactly how the comment had actually landed. I did not know yet, laughing along at that table, that I would remember that exact joke again, years later, standing in a hospital room at an hour when sundown had nothing at all to do with why I was staying. The first 2 years of our marriage, the distance from both women lived in small rooms, not large ones. Diane stopped asking me anything about Maple Ridge's mission projects, though she asked Caleb every year without fail how Riverside's youth group fundraiser was going. Brooke began scheduling her own children's birthday parties on Saturday afternoons without exception, year after year, and when I finally asked her gently whether a Sunday might work instead, just once, she told me Saturdays were simply when everyone in her circle was free, and that she was sorry if that was inconvenient for me, in a tone that made clear she did not consider it her problem to solve. Diane gave me a set of dish towels the week Rachel was born, plain cotton ones her own mother had once embroidered, one of them stitched with a small fading sunset along the border, and she told me, handing them over, that she had always meant to pass them to whichever of her children's wives seemed most likely to actually use them properly, and I understood even then that the compliment came with a quiet asterisk attached, though I thanked her warmly and used them every week regardless. There was a particular kind of conditional warmth that ran underneath nearly every visit those first 2 years, real kindness at the surface, distance at anything that touched faith directly. Diane would ask after my parents, my work, Rachel's naps, with genuine interest, and never once asked what a Sabbath actually meant to me, only, occasionally, what was inconvenient about it. She never once invited me to pray with her before a meal at her own table, though I offered gently more than once and was gently turned down every time, redirected instead to help carry dishes in from the kitchen. The summer Rachel turned 2, Diane began, without asking either of us, bringing her to Riverside's vacation Bible school some weekday mornings while she watched her, a fine thing on its own, except that she also began quietly correcting the small grace Rachel had learned to say before snacks at our own house, telling her once, gently enough that Rachel did not seem troubled by it at all, that at Grandma's house we just say a simple thank you. No need for all that other business. And I heard about it only afterward, from Rachel herself, repeating the phrase back to me at our own table, with the plain, unbothered logic of a toddler reporting one more interesting fact about the world. I did not make an issue of it with Diane directly, not yet, though I did quietly begin saying our own family's blessing with Rachel each morning before Diane arrived to collect her, wanting at least one part of the day to belong entirely to us before it belonged to anyone else. At Diane's table, the person who blessed a meal had always been her husband Frank, and I had assumed, in those early years, that I might eventually be asked to say a blessing myself, the way family does when they are folding someone all the way in. It never happened, not once in 3 years, not even the year I brought a dish my own grandmother had taught me. Frank asked. Caleb asked. Some years. I was never once asked, and I came to understand the omission was not accidental, that some part of Diane did not consider a blessing spoken by a Sabbath-keeping daughter-in-law to carry quite the same weight, however gently she would have denied that if I had ever said it to her face, which for years I did not. There was a 4th of July gathering in our second year where Caleb's cousin Amy, a kind, easygoing woman who has never once said an unkind word to me, asked across the table what a full Sabbath actually looked like from the inside. Genuinely curious. And before I could answer, Brooke said, from the porch swing, without looking up from her phone, "Oh, You'd have to ask Miriam. She's the only one of us who thinks Saturday is a religion instead of a day off," and laughed a laugh with no real warmth folded into it. The table went quiet, the particular length of time it takes a family to decide whether to say something, and then Amy asked about the potato salad instead, and we all let her. Caleb heard it. I watched him hear it. He said nothing that day, and I will tell you honestly that in that exact moment I was angrier at my own husband than I had ever once been at either woman, because they were only being who they had always been, and he was the one choosing silence right when it mattered most. We drove home that night in a long quiet, and somewhere past the county line he reached over and took my hand and said he should have said something back there, and I said yes, he should have, and for longer than either of us would like to admit, he did not. And I want you to understand this is not a story where the husband gets everything right from the start. Our daughter Rachel was born in our second year of marriage, and both women came to the hospital, held her, cried real tears, and told me she was beautiful, and I believed every word, because a new grandchild was the one thing in this whole story nobody ever pretended not to love completely. But there was a Saturday, the summer Rachel turned 2, when Diane drove out and collected her while I was at the store, leaving a note that read, "Thought she'd love the church playground today. Back by supper. Love, Grandma." And I came home to an empty house and sat down at the counter and cried, before I ever got angry, because it was not the playground itself that wounded me. It was the plain fact that some part of Diane still believed my permission on a matter like this was a courtesy, rather than a requirement. Caleb called her the moment I told him. One of the very few times in this whole story I heard him truly raise his voice on a phone call. And Diane apologized for that specific thing within the week. Short and stiff, nothing like the apology she would eventually give me, but real as far as it went. There was a similar sting the year Riverside printed its new church directory, a glossy booklet with a family photo page for every household connected to the congregation. Diane, without asking, submitted a page for Caleb's family using a photo from a picnic the summer before, listing Rachel's birthday underneath, and, beneath that, the line raised in the Lord at Riverside Community Church, which was not entirely true, and which Diane had simply assumed or perhaps hoped hard enough to write down as though hoping could make it so. Caleb called the church office himself and asked them to adjust the wording before the directories went to print, a short, awkward phone call that embarrassed everyone involved. Diane never mentioned the incident to either of us again, though Frank told me later she sat alone at her own kitchen table the night it happened longer than usual, after everyone else had gone to bed, which was the first time I understood that some of what looked like certainty in her might actually be grief dressed up to look like conviction. There was one incident from that same season that came closer to true anger in me than almost anything else in this story, and it involved Brooke rather than Diane. She had begun, over that second year, making a standing joke at every family gathering about my Sabbath rest being a convenient excuse to avoid helping with the dishes, said lightly enough each time that calling her out on it would have made me look humorless in front of everyone, and repeated often enough that I began, without quite noticing it happening, to dread the exact moment in every family meal when the dishes started clearing, bracing myself for the same tired line dressed up in a slightly new outfit each time. I never told her how much it wore on me. I simply started leaving the room a few minutes before dessert ended, and I do not think either one of us ever named, out loud, why that had become my habit. Diane enlisted an old friend from her women's Bible study, a kind, well-meaning woman named Carol Ashby, to sit with Caleb over coffee that same season and gently ask, in Carol's own words to me much later, whether he ever worried our daughter would grow up confused, caught between two such different rhythms of faith. Caleb told her no, not confused, just loved by two households instead of one, and Carol had not really had an answer for that and had gone back to talking about the weather. Diane's own Bible study met every Tuesday morning at Riverside, a dozen women who prayed over each other's families with real devotion, and I learned years into my marriage from a woman named Susan who eventually became one of my few real allies inside that congregation, that my name had appeared on their prayer list more than once, worded carefully, the way such things always are. Please lift up Caleb's wife as she finds greater freedom in her walk with the Lord. Nobody on that list, Susan told me, ever said an unkind word about me directly, and I believe that. But I also understood, once I knew, that I had spent years being discussed gently and prayerfully by a room full of women I had never once been invited to sit among. And there is a particular kind of loneliness in being prayed about steadily by people who have never once asked you what you actually believe. There was a family reunion the summer Rachel turned 2, held at a rented lake house with nearly 40 of Caleb's relatives crowded onto the same dock, that became the hardest single afternoon of this entire story. An uncle I had met only twice asked, kindly enough, whether it was true my church did not believe in the immortality of the soul the way the rest of the family did, and before I could answer in my own words, Brooke, 2 chairs over, said, "Oh, don't get her started. We'll be here past sundown, and then she'll really have to leave." And the whole dock laughed, and Diane, rather than redirecting the conversation the way she sometimes did, added, gently enough that it still cut deep, "Well, it is a lot of rules for one young family to carry, isn't it?" And I sat there in a folding chair in front of nearly 40 people I mostly did not know well, feeling my face go hot, and said only that I was happy to answer any real question anyone had, and then excused myself to check on Rachel, who did not need checking on at all. I cried in a bathroom at that lake house for the better part of 10 minutes before I could make myself walk back out onto that dock with a steady face, and Caleb found me there afterward and held me a long while without saying anything, which was, that particular afternoon, exactly the right thing for him to do. I want to say plainly that none of this made either woman a villain, and I never once believed it did. Diane showed up for every school event once Rachel was old enough for them, every ordinary Tuesday when Caleb needed an extra set of hands. Brooke, whatever her jokes, never once forgot Rachel's birthday, always arrived with a thoughtful gift picked out with real care. What neither woman could yet do was trust that the particular shape of rest I was building into our family's week was as sturdy and as loving as the rhythm each of them had built her own life around. What I did through those years, and I say this without any pride at all, because pride is not what carried me, was mostly nothing dramatic. I did not write either woman a letter defending my church. I did not ask Caleb to sit them down formally and settle things once and for all. I kept the Sabbath every single week I was able, the candle lit at the same hour, the same unhurried walk along the river once the dishes from Friday supper were done, the same quiet morning at Maple Ridge, not because anyone was watching, but because it is simply the shape of my days. Susan, from Diane's own Bible study, began stopping by my house some Thursday afternoons that same year, at first only to drop off a casserole for a family 2 streets over, and then, gradually, to simply sit at my table a while, and I learned she had quietly left my name off that prayer list herself more than once when the wording started to feel less like concern and more like gossip dressed up in a blessing, though she never told Diane she had done it. We started volunteering together some Sunday afternoons at a small food pantry, run out of a Lutheran church 2 towns over, and there is a particular kind of trust that grows between 2 women loading canned goods into the same cardboard boxes for a few hours at a stretch. A trust that has nothing to do with which day of the week either one of you calls holy. Susan never once asked me to explain my faith to her the way that Uncle had at the lake house. She simply worked alongside me and watched, and told me once, folding a box flap closed, that she had decided long ago to trust her own eyes over other people's opinions, and that her eyes had never once shown her anything in me worth doubting. There was a stretch of that same season where I began, without quite admitting it to myself, keeping a private tally of every small slight, the birthday parties, the joke about the dishes, the lake house afternoon, the way Diane's eyes had stayed open through my own wedding, and I noticed that tally growing heavier in my chest every time Caleb's phone rang with his mother's name on the screen. A small dread I did not like feeling toward a woman I still, underneath all of it, wanted to love well. I prayed about that tally more than once, asking God plainly whether I was allowed to simply stop trying with people who did not seem to want my effort in the first place, and I never once got a clear answer, only a persistent, quiet sense that the tally itself was the actual problem, more than either woman's behavior was. It was that same season that I very nearly stopped trying with either of them. I drove to my own mother's house on a Wednesday afternoon with Rachel asleep in her car seat, sat at her kitchen table and told her I was tired, clean through, of being the only person at every gathering whose faithfulness got treated like an inconvenient hobby rather than a conviction. My mother let me finish before she said a word, then told me, "Miriam, nobody would fault you for pulling back some, but ask yourself whether you are staying at that table for them, or for Rachel, and for Caleb, and for the woman you actually want to be 10 years from now, whether or not either one of them ever comes around." I sat with that a long while and finally said, "I think I want to be someone who does not need either of them to change in order for me to stay kind." My mother said, "Then that is your answer, and it is the harder road twice over, since you are carrying it for two people instead of one, and I am sorry for that. If more than one person in your own family has ever treated your faithfulness like an inconvenience rather than a conviction, I would love to know how long you have been carrying that, and whether it has started to lift yet. Subscribe if this story is speaking to something in your own life, because there are more of these coming every week. I want to be honest that I did not always live up to what I told my mother that day. What I can tell you is that I kept the Sabbath the following Friday anyway, the same quiet rhythm, the same unhurried Saturday walks along the river, which is a smaller, more ordinary kind of faithfulness than this story might make it sound, and which turned out to be the only kind that actually holds. An ordinary Friday evening at our own house looked something like this, in case you have never seen one from the inside. The whole kitchen scrubbed clean by late afternoon, a loaf of bread cooling on the counter, Caleb home early from work without needing to be asked twice, Rachel bathed and in soft pajamas well before the actual sundown, since a toddler does not much care what the almanac says about the exact minute. We would light the candle together, Rachel's small hand always reaching for the match even though she was never once allowed to hold it, and Caleb would say a blessing over the bread in his own plain, unhurried voice, and then we simply sat. No television, no phones on the table, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The whole evening stretched out ahead of us with nowhere else it needed to go. It was never dramatic. It was never meant to be. It was simply the one evening a week when our whole small family remembered, together, that we belonged to someone larger than our own calendar, and I have come to believe that ordinary, undramatic evening is exactly the thing neither Diane nor Brooke could picture clearly enough to trust, until they finally watched what I was willing to walk away from it for. There was a Thanksgiving that same year that tested me nearly as hard as the porch swing comment had. Diane mentioned, in a voice trying hard to sound offhand, that she had scheduled the family gathering that year for the Saturday rather than the usual Sunday, since it suited more of the extended family's travel plans, and I understood the moment she said it exactly what that scheduling would cost me. I spent that entire holiday explaining, gently and more than once, why I would be joining everyone a few hours later than planned, fielding careful questions from an aunt I had never met about whether my own church even considered itself Christian at all, answering as generously as I knew how, while Rachel, not yet 3, grew fussier and fussier in her high chair, until Caleb finally excused the two of us early. Caleb and I had our own hard season during those years too, and I do not want to leave that out. There was a stretch not long after Rachel's second birthday, where he grew quieter than usual on drives home from Birch Hollow, and one night I finally asked him what was sitting on him, and he admitted that some part of him still wondered, in his weaker moments, whether his mother and sister had a point buried somewhere, underneath all the wrong ways they kept expressing it. Whether a household built around so many careful boundaries really could end up teaching a child that love has conditions attached to it. I did not take that personally, though it stung to hear. I told him that rest kept out of love was never the same thing as rules kept out of fear, and that the question he was actually wrestling with was his own to work out, not mine to settle for him, and that I would stand beside him through it either way. He has told me since that conversation steadied him more than almost any other one in this whole story. Rachel herself, meanwhile, was growing up exactly the way both women had once feared she might, which is to say she was growing up entirely unbothered by any of it. She learned to say the blessing over Friday supper in her own small, serious voice before she could properly pronounce half the words, and she learned, just as easily, to sing along at Riverside Sunday service when Diane brought her along some weeks, and I watched her carry both rhythms in her small body without a single sign of the confusion either woman had once predicted, the way children so often manage to hold two true things at once, long before the adults around them figure out how. There was an afternoon that same year when Rachel, not yet 3, asked me plainly why Grandma's church met on the day everyone else called Church Day and ours met on a different one, and I told her both days belonged to God, and some families just like to visit him at different times, the way some families eat supper earlier than others, and she considered that for a moment and said only, "Okay," and went back to her blocks, and I have thought since that her whole small, unbothered okay carried more theological peace than either grown woman in this story had managed across 3 years. If you have ever watched a child carry two different rhythms of faith more gracefully than the adults around her ever managed to, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to see how the rest of this story turns out, because there are more stories like it waiting for you here. There was a Christmas that same year, Rachel not yet 3, where Caleb finally did the thing I had waited years for him to do, without ever asking him to do it. Brooke, clearing the dishes, made her usual joke about my convenient Saturday exemption, and before I could decide whether to leave the room the way I always did, Caleb set down the plate he was holding and said, plainly, evenly, that his wife had never once used her faith to get out of a single obligation in this family, and that he would appreciate it if that particular joke was retired for good. The table went quiet the same particular length it always did in that house when something true and uncomfortable had just been said out loud, and Brooke, of all people, was the one who finally broke the silence by asking whether anyone wanted more pie, and the meal moved on. Caleb reached for my hand under the table afterward, and neither one of us said anything about it on the drive home, because some things do not need to be discussed to be understood. If you have ever watched the person you love finally find the courage to stand beside you out loud, after years of standing quietly to the side instead, I would love to know about it in the comments below. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it, because the hardest part of this story is coming up next. It was an ordinary Friday evening the following spring, not long before sundown, when Frank called Caleb from Birch Hollow, his voice tighter than I had ever heard it, saying Diane had collapsed in the kitchen, unable to catch her breath, her lips going the wrong color, and that the ambulance was already on its way to the hospital in St. Joseph. Caleb was out the door before he had even finished the sentence. I stood in my own kitchen for one long moment, my Sabbath candle already lit on the counter, the whole quiet evening I had been looking forward to all week sitting there unclaimed, and I picked up my keys and blew the candle out and drove to that hospital without a single thought toward what day it happened to be. The waiting room at that hour was mostly empty, fluorescent lights humming over rows of chairs bolted to the floor, a television playing the weather, with the sound turned down low. Frank paced the length of it and back again more times than I could count, his work shirt still smelling faintly of the shop, and every time a set of doors opened he stopped mid-stride, hoping for news, and every time it was not for us, he started pacing again. A nurse came out once, early on, to say only that they were running tests and that someone would update us as soon as there was anything real to say, and I watched Frank's shoulders drop half an inch at even that small scrap of information, the way a person's whole body can learn to ration hope in small enough portions to survive an evening like that one. What we found, once they finally let us back, was a woman smaller and more frightened than I had ever seen her, an oxygen mask fogging with each shallow breath, a doctor using the word anaphylaxis and asking questions about a medication reaction nobody had seen coming. The next several hours ran together the way hospital hours do, waiting rooms, hushed conversations with nurses, Frank's hand gripping the arm of a plastic chair like it was the only steady thing left in the building. Brooke arrived a little after 9, her own children left with a neighbor, her hair still pulled back from an evening she had clearly not expected to leave, and found me still in the same chair I had taken when we first arrived, a small prayer journal open on my lap, and she asked, quieter than I had ever heard her ask anything, whether I was not supposed to be resting right now. I told her the truth, that the Sabbath was never meant to keep me away from a bed where someone I loved was frightened, that resting and loving someone through a crisis were never actually opposites, and that I would rather explain that to God myself than explain to either of them why I had stayed home. Brooke did not say anything else for a long while. She simply sat down 2 chairs over and stayed the rest of the night beside me, both of us quiet, both of us waiting on the same news. Diane was stabilized a little after midnight and moved to a regular room, weak but breathing steadily on her own, and I stayed at her bedside through what remained of that night, while Caleb drove home to relieve the sitter and bring Rachel back in the morning. I do not know exactly when Diane woke enough to notice me there, only that around 3 in the morning she opened her eyes, found me still sitting in the chair beside her bed, my own Bible open on my knee, and said nothing, only reached for my hand and held it the rest of the night, and I understood, without either of us saying a word, that something in her was already beginning to turn over. Rachel arrived the next morning with Caleb, not yet 3 years old, and climbed up onto the edge of Diane's hospital bed the moment she was allowed, folded her small hands the way she had watched me do 100 times, and said, unprompted, "Thank you, God, for making Grandma's breathing better, and please help her feel strong again soon, and thank you that Mommy stayed the whole night even though it was her special resting day. Amen." It was not a polished prayer. It ran together the way a small child's prayers do, every request tumbling into the next, but it was exactly what it was. An honest, unrehearsed thanks from a girl who had watched something quietly remarkable happen and had no other way to hold it. Brooke, standing near the window, had to turn away toward the glass for a long moment before anyone could see her face. Diane came home from the hospital 5 days later, tired but steady, and did not speak much about that night for nearly a month. She kept to herself more than usual during that stretch, according to Frank, sitting some evenings on their own back porch long after supper was cleared, and when he asked her once, gently, what she was turning over out there in the dark, she told him only that she was trying to work out how she had managed to spend 20 years teaching other women about grace, without ever once extending an ounce of it to the one person in her own family who had actually shown her what grace looked like in practice. Brooke, for her part, called me twice that same month. Short, ordinary calls about nothing in particular, checking in the way you check in on someone you are quietly rethinking your whole history with, though neither one of us named what either call was really about. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, of all days, Diane asked Caleb to bring her by our house, alone, without Frank, without Brooke, which she had never once done in 3 years. I made tea. We sat at my own kitchen table, and she held the cup a long while before she said anything at all. Then she said, "Miriam, I owe you an apology, and I am not going to make it short, because you have earned a long one, and I have had a month to work out what I would say if I ever found the nerve." I did not say anything. I have learned that the kindest thing you can do for someone working up to something hard is simply let them arrive. She said, "I decided who you were before I ever gave you a real chance to show me otherwise. That very first Sunday afternoon, before you had said more than a handful of words to me. I told myself I was worried about whether a household built on so many rules could ever teach a child real joy. Some of that was true, but if I am honest, most of it was my own old fear, that a love with rules attached to it must not be love all the way through, and I put that fear on you, and it was never fair, because you never once gave me a single real reason to believe it." She said, "I scheduled that birthday dinner on a Friday evening on purpose more than once, and I told myself I was simply being practical, and some part of me knew exactly what I was doing every single time. I watched you leave early, year after year, and some small, ungenerous part of me felt almost satisfied by it, as though your leaving proved my old theory correct, instead of proving only that you kept a promise you had made to God long before you ever met my son. And then I lay in that hospital bed and watched you blow out your own candle without a second thought and drive to sit beside a woman who had never once made that easy for you, and there was more of God in that single night than I managed to name in 20 years of teaching a women's Bible study. I spent 3 years looking for the hollow place underneath your Saturdays, Miriam, and I never found it, because it was never there to find. I was wrong about you, the way you are wrong about the whole shape of a person's heart, not the small way you are wrong about a recipe or a road. And I am asking you plainly to forgive me. I was crying by then too, and what actually happened is that I got up and hugged her, and she held on longer and tighter than she ever had in 3 years. When we finally sat back down, all I managed to say was, "I forgive you, Diane. I have loved you this whole time. I just needed you to know it was safe to love me back." She laughed, a wet, unsteady sound, and said, "Well, I suppose I finally do." Brooke came to see me on her own, a week later, and her apology was shorter, plainer, the kind that costs a different sort of person a different sort of nerve. She sat on my porch steps, turning a coffee mug around in her hands without drinking from it, and said, "I made you into a joke for 3 years because it was easier than admitting I envied how settled you always seemed about something I have never once felt settled about myself. My own faith has always felt like something I show up for on Sunday mornings and mostly forget about by Tuesday, and watching you build a whole rhythm around it, a whole day, made me feel small in a way I did not know how to say out loud, so I made it small instead, out loud, in front of everyone, because that felt easier than saying the truer thing. I watched you sit in that waiting room at midnight, not resting at all, still finding some way to be faithful to something, even while your whole ordinary Friday evening was falling apart around you. And I understood I had never actually been laughing at a rule. I had been laughing at you, and underneath that, laughing at my own restlessness. And I am sorry, and I would like to actually know what your Sabbath is for, if you would ever want to tell me." I told her I would love nothing more, and we have had coffee most Thursday mornings since, and she has never once made that particular joke again. I want to tell you what happened in the months after that, because reconciliation in real life is never one perfect conversation. It is 100 small corrections running the other direction now. Diane started asking real questions about the Sabbath, not barbed ones. What does the rest actually feel like from inside it? Does the quiet ever get uncomfortable? What do I love most about it? I answered her honestly every time, and told her plainly that even I had certain Saturdays where my mind wandered same as anyone's, and she seemed to appreciate that I was not selling her a story. She also started asking me, that same spring, to bless a plate at every holiday meal now, the same way she had always let Frank do it, and the first time she asked me directly in front of the whole table, I had to look down at my own hands a moment before I could get the words out steady. There was a Saturday afternoon that same summer, not long after Diane had come home from the hospital for good, when she asked, almost shyly, whether she might join Caleb, Rachel, and me on our regular walk along the river, and I told her of course, and she came dressed for it, sensible shoes and all, and walked the whole slow loop beside us without once mentioning her own schedule or how much of the afternoon it was taking up. Near the end of that walk, she told me she had forgotten, in the busyness of running a household and leading a Bible study for 2 decades, what it actually felt like to walk anywhere with absolutely nowhere else to be, and that she had decided she wanted to remember it more often. She has joined us most months since, not every week. She is careful to say that part plainly. She has not become something she is not, but often enough that Rachel now simply assumes Grandma will be there for at least one Saturday walk a month, and plans her small hand accordingly to be held by both of us at once along the parts of the trail that run closest to the water. Diane also asked me, that same year, to teach her the small blessing my grandmother used to say over Friday bread, and I sat with her at her own kitchen table and wrote it out for her in her own handwriting, so she would not have to ask me to repeat it, and she keeps that folded paper tucked inside the cover of the Bible study workbook she still leads every Tuesday morning, though she has never once used it in front of her own group. Only, she told me once, at her own kitchen counter some Friday evenings, when the house is quiet, and Frank is out at the shop a little later than usual, simply to feel closer to whatever it is that has finally made peace between the two of us. She has never once managed to stop herself, at least once every holiday since, from mentioning that she still cannot understand giving up a perfectly good Saturday afternoon of errands, and I have decided I do not want that particular complaint to ever fully go away, because a story with every rough edge sanded down would stop sounding like the truth, and this one still does. Rachel's fourth birthday party was held 2 Sundays ago, at our own house, and both Diane and Brooke came early to help set up rather than arriving right at the hour, something neither one of them had ever done before. Brooke brought her own 2 children along an hour earlier than the party actually started, just so they could join our regular Saturday walk the afternoon before. A small new habit she has decided. In her own words, she does not want her own kids to miss out on simply because she spent 3 years making fun of it. Before the cake was cut, Diane asked if she might say something first, and told the small gathered family that she had spent 3 years afraid of a kind of rest she had never once actually tried herself, and that she was standing there that afternoon because her own granddaughter had taught her more about real faithfulness in one hospital room than she had managed to teach in 20 years of leading a Bible study. Brooke, beside her, added only that she was sorry it took her 3 years and a bad Friday night to finally ask a real question instead of making a tired joke, and that she was asking now. Rachel, no older than the day of that hospital room prayer but sturdier in her sentences now, said the words are still coming, Grandma, and everyone laughed, and I thought, we made it. We actually made it. Diane also defended me in a way I did not learn about until later. An old friend from her Bible study made an offhand comment at a women's breakfast, months after the hospital stay, about how it must be strange for Caleb, married into a family with such a different rhythm, and Diane, according to Susan, set down her coffee and told her plainly that her daughter-in-law had walked away from her own day of rest, without a second thought to sit through a night nobody had asked her to sit through, and that the woman ought to be careful confusing inconvenient with empty in front of her ever again. Susan said the table went quiet, the same particular length it had gone quiet at that old lake house years before, except this time it was Diane who had said the hard, true thing, and nobody argued with her. Here is where everyone stands now, since I know you will want to know. Diane keeps a small candle of her own now, not lit for the Sabbath exactly. She is careful to say that part plainly, but lit every Friday evening regardless, in what she calls her own quiet way of thinking of us. She still uses those same embroidered dish towels she once gave me, insisting on washing them herself whenever she visits, and I have decided that particular small habit is its own quiet apology, repeated once a month without either of us ever needing to mention it out loud. Frank, for his part, has never once needed convincing of anything in this whole story, and he likes to remind us of that at every family gathering, half joking that he was on my side from the very first pie, and that it only took the rest of the family a hospital scare to catch up to where he had been standing all along. Susan still leaves my name off any prayer request that starts to sound more like gossip than care, and tells me now, plainly, whenever a well-meaning woman at Riverside tries to start one anyway. And Carol Ashby, the woman who once sat with Caleb over coffee at Diane's own quiet request, still asks after Rachel every time our paths cross at the grocery store, though she has never once, since that hospital spring, asked whether our daughter seemed confused between 2 different rhythms of faith, only whether she is happy, which I have come to believe is the only question any of them ever truly needed to be asking in the first place. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story, with more than one person in your family still needing the same proof before either of them believes you, I want you to hear this. What worked in the end was simply showing up plainly, faithfully, for longer than felt fair, and letting the ordinary shape of an honest life speak for itself in its own time. Rest kept out of love and rules kept out of fear were never the same thing, though it took a Friday night in an emergency department and a 3-year-old's unrehearsed prayer to finally teach both women I love, besides my own husband, the difference between them. I have thought often, since that spring, about how strange it is that 2 women who had spent 3 years disapproving of me for entirely different reasons of their own needed nearly the exact same proof before either one of them could finally set that disapproval down, as though whatever fear or envy each of them was really protecting had, underneath all the different jokes and all the different scheduling, been built from the very same material the whole time. Rachel will grow up never remembering a single Friday evening when her grandmother's name on the phone made her mother's shoulders tense, which is its own small miracle, since it means the years I lived inside will be nothing more to her than a story her mother tells sometimes, the way you tell a child about weather that passed through long before she was born. My own mother, hearing the whole story afterward, told me only that she had always believed the hardest years of a marriage are rarely the ones between the husband and wife themselves. They are the ones spent waiting on everyone standing around that marriage to finally catch up to what the two of you already knew, and that she was glad, for my sake, that the waiting had finally come to an end, while Rachel was still young enough to grow up inside the peace instead of the wreckage. That is my story. 3 years, one Friday night, one small girl's tumbling prayer beside a hospital bed, and 2 separate walls that came down within the same season. Not because anyone tore at either one, but because they finally had no reason left standing. If someone in your life has ever needed years, or needed it twice over from 2 different people, to truly see your faith as real, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, because I believe there are more of us out there than any of us realize. And if this one meant something to you, share it with somebody still waiting on an apology from more than one person. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one.